Of all the things that I hear people asking about or talking about as far as adventure design goes, the most difficult part for many people seems to be the beginning. So I wanted to talk today about kind of breaking down kind of my thoughts on how to set up a good beginning for an adventure. And so I'd like to break this down into three parts, and I'll kind of go into detail and talk about how you can kind of vary the various parts. But really, what it comes down to for me is you got the setup, you got the hook, and then there's a transition to the adventure. So all of that I would lump into the beginning, because everything after that is the adventure proper. Now, it's all part of the adventure, but the beginning of the adventure is often a little harder to set up than just go doing the dungeon crawl or fighting the bad guy or whatever it is. So to begin with, the setup. Now, the setup is exactly as it sounds. It's the baseline from which you're setting up this adventure. You are setting your tone. You're setting you're placing the party and the players in the setting, and kind of showing them what it is that they're doing before this adventure begins. Now, if you're doing old school style adventuring, this is often pretty straightforward. The setup is you've been traveling for days, you've crossed the valley of such and such, and now you stand before the vaulted doors of the ancient dwarven hold. That's a pretty simple setup. The typical setup that is most commonly joked about is you're sitting in an inn. You're all in an inn. But the setup can be really anything that puts the players in a place to receive the adventure. Whether you're sitting in an inn, or you're traveling to a nearby festival, or participating in that festival, maybe the party is in a church or a temple in the middle of a particular ritual. Maybe they're at court, and there's just the normal humdrum of that. They could be at a contest. They could be just walking down the street. The setup is anything, and this is the thing. Talking about people getting stuck on how to start an adventure can come from nowhere. And just because it starts in a place doesn't mean that that's necessarily what it's related to. Remember, the setup doesn't have to specifically tie in to the adventure proper. It's just a starting place. Now, in the setup, you also want to make sure that this is the opportunity that you have as a DM to create a sense of space and place. This is where you're going to put in a lot of description right off the bat. You're going to come out of the gate. Really want to make sure that the players feel where they are and why they're there, and even if that's just a minor thing, you're out doing your weekly market visit. The market is bustling. You can hear the barkers, calling out their prices and trying to entice customers. The smell of, fresh produce and raw meat, and and the gathering of the peasantry is everywhere. Spices waft across that every so often, signifying that there might be some exotic wares. Entertainers are there. Fire eaters are trying to gather your attention for a few coins. Just make sure that you're setting up using this descriptive language to set up the environment for for where you're going to draw the players into adventure. Now, once you've got the setup going, one final note on the setup: this is also a good place to lay in foreshadowing. If your adventure is going to be about problems with goblins that have been in the area, then you can have maybe an NPC or some part of your description that indicates that there is some sort of overwhelming gloom or concern with goblins. If war is looming on the horizon, you could describe, as the players are moving through the streets of the city, how they see another cart full of wounded soldiers rattling through a procession of beleaguered fighters following behind that. If it is a werewolves or some sort of haunting, describe how the windows of the village are now shrouded in fishing nets. This is supposedly it's a superstition that helps to keep the evil things out. Maybe all the doors are painted with a certain color, or there are lambs' heads that have been mounted above the front doors of various buildings to prevent evil spirits from coming in. This will set the mood for the game and can actually help foreshadow what the adventure is. And it's important here to make sure you throw that stuff in, because when we get to the next part, which is the hook, you want to make sure that you've done your best to help the players take that hook, because nothing is worse than throwing out, you've set it up, you present the hook for the adventure, and then the players don't bite. It's not the end of the world, and we'll certainly go into that in a moment, but it is a point of frustration, and you can alleviate a lot of that by putting some work into your initial setup with foreshadowing, good description, and making sure that there is a sense of place and that what space the game is taking place in. So, after you've got your initial setup, we then move on to the hook. So the hook is that thing that grabs the attention of the players and the party of adventurers and pulls them into the adventure or on their way to the adventure. Now, the hook can be something very obvious and upfront and direct. It could be, a peasant running up to the players and tugging on the sleeves of the paladin and beseeching him to save his kidnapped son. It could be something equally as obvious. If you have a cleric in the party, they could be called to the temple of their god and given a task to do in the name of their order. But it could also be something more subtle. It could be on their way to after they've left the city. Maybe perhaps you set up the adventure at they're picking up their supplies before the next leg of their journey. So they leave the city. They're moving down the road. Up ahead, they see smoke or dust. Off the road to the east, there's a cloud of dust. It looks like there's been some sort of action over there. There could be a portent or some sort of symbol or something that they see along the way. Perhaps a rune or a symbol is carved into a tree. Perhaps there is a sign that's never been there before, that they read it and it points them in a direction. They find a bottle on the ground that has a note in it. And they read it, and they find out that it's a call for help. These are the hooks. You don't want to be too subtle with your hook, but you don't have to be in your face, slap across the face kind of a thing. You want to make sure that whatever you're doing is going to appeal to the players and the party members, the characters. And this is another important thing about the hook. If you, as a GM, know the players well, maybe you've played a few adventures with them, it should be easier to do this, but it's always good to play off of what you know about those characters. If you have a paladin who just loves to run off and take up a good cause, then that's easy. You can always feed them a good cause. But you don't want to constantly use one character as the in route. So perhaps the paladin isn't the guy you're going to work with this time. Maybe it's the fighter. Maybe the fighter, he's from this town, and he recognizes the label on the bottle you find with the note. And this is the label of his friend who's a brewer. And he knows that, these bottles are specific to that guy, and that, this might pique his interest. You want to be flexible with your hooks. Understand that your players may not bite at the first presentation of the hook. Don't be afraid if they don't. So if the peasant comes out and tugs on the sleeves of the paladin and says, "Please help me, my son's been taken," and the rest of the party's like, no, we're fine, or they kind of brush it off, crazy peasant, for whatever reason they don't bite at that. Down the road, could be that, so this peasant has begged to them, to help find their son, and maybe as they're moving through the market, they hear people talking and kind of gossiping about the loss of other children or other people of the village. Maybe it's not just children, maybe it's other people of the village. Could be there are posted missing posters. If you have a relatively established setting with literary or literate individuals and a source for people to get drawings and stuff made, then you could easily have like a town crier or a message board or something. Maybe it's nothing with pictures, but maybe it's just a board where there are placards hanging with the names of the lost. And as your players come up and they've ignored the peasant, but then they see the board with 16 placards of lost villagers' names hanging there, then they might get interested. Now they could go ask around some more, and this is where you get to use those NPCs to fill in the blanks and to kind of tug that hook to kind of set it with your party. If the party were to, say, leave town and the hook was in town and they ignored that, so again, let's say you've set up all the bit with the werewolves, the party is suitably unnerved or understandably unnerved because of the existence or the presence of werewolves in the area, and they decide that they're going to get out of town. Well, a werewolf could perhaps attack them on the road. They could find carnage from a werewolf attack. They could hear howling off in the distance and realize that it's coming from the direction of a farmstead off the road. And as they watch and kind of listen, they can see the first glimmer of firelight in the evening gloom, as they realize that the farmstead is caught on fire. And so next thing you know, your party may be running off. They get there. Maybe they get there in time and they fight off one or two werewolves, or maybe they get there too late. The werewolves are gone, the farmstead's burning. But with his last breath, the dying farmer beseeches the players to please avenge me. Now, if you have a paladin in the party, vengeance is always a good cause. If you've got a sympathetic cleric or a fighter with a soft heart, it's good. Just work with your players, work with the characters in the party. So after you've got the hook set and the party is on their way to adventure, the last real part of getting your adventure going is the transition into the adventure proper. Now, sometimes this is just going to be a natural thing and doesn't require any special consideration. If the quest is go to the ancient barrow on the hills in the west and retrieve a reliquary, well, clearly the transition to the adventure proper is going to start roughly around where you enter the barrow. It might start as soon as the party leaves, because maybe you've got some wilderness encounters planned, but make sure that you have some idea in mind how you're going to transition from traveling to the adventure. Now, is this seeing the barrows? Is this suddenly being beset by a bunch of carrion birds, rotting crows that are pecking and flying at the heroes as they near the barrow and chasing them towards the barrow? Is it meeting with, in the earlier was mentioning perhaps one setup might be that there was war on the horizon. Maybe the transition from the adventure from the hook to the adventure is meeting up with the commander at the nearest military camp and receiving your order and then being directed to where you're supposed to have this task. Maybe you were recruited in town and now you have to go to the camp to then be sent to your actual mission proper. The natural flow is often what you're going to run into, where the hook is very, very specific, very direct. Sometimes it's okay to do things like, a fade and open. All right, so the hook was, I need you to travel. You must travel 3 days and meet up at Camp Dunstan, and so you go to Camp Dunstan. So the fade might be, and so you left town. If travel encounters aren't important to this adventure and you really don't want to, you don't feel like as a GM you need to tax the party resources yet, then you can just fade and open with, after 3 days travel, you reach the camp, the clink and clank of blacksmiths, the rattling of armor and weapons, the braying of donkeys, the neighing of horses, and the chatter of worn men, and then they can get in there. There's also the dramatic turn. This kind of is that carrion crow thing I was mentioning, where they're on their way and suddenly there's an attack. But maybe the adventure is, I've got to go to the military camp, and on the way there, the party is suddenly confronted by soldiers fleeing. Panicked soldiers, some of them torn to shreds, a cart on fire rattling past them. In the distance, the sound of a bellowing roar and the whoosh above as something huge flies through the smoke in the air. They may have just found their dragon. They're not necessarily you're going to probably catch them a little flat-footed because they were in travel mode, but now suddenly they're faced with a dragon. They were expecting to go to the military camp. They're expecting to have a conversation with the general, and now they're in the middle of a battle. This could be weather. You could have, I'm traveling and suddenly there's a storm. The other thing is keep in mind that you're kind of going back to the hook and the transition. Sometimes the hook isn't actually connected to the adventure at all, and the transition may be redirecting to the actual adventure. If the hook was to go to the military camp and meet up with the general and find out what the situation is and return information to the local mayor, so he knows how many men he needs to recruit for the next Fyrd. And on the way there, the party hears a strange, haunting singing from the woods and goes to investigate, because your adventure was actually to investigate a haunted manor house that is back in the woods, or some ancient, grove spirit or something, some sort of fey interaction. Your transition and your hook may actually be one and the same. In that case, you're going to go with a transition that is sort of a natural flow as a misdirect off the hook. But in the end, your setup, your hook, and your transition, these can be as on point and direct, or as broad and kind of all over the place as you need them to be. Make sure that even when they seem to be all over the place, they're actually directing to something specific. Being too vague or offering too many options, you don't want red herrings up front. when you're really trying to get the players to take the MacGuffin. Red herrings can happen down the road if you have an extended multi-adventure campaign arc, but avoid red herrings in the course of an adventure unless that adventure is very mystery based, in which case red herrings are perfectly natural. But kind of a final note here, when you're don't be afraid to play with your adventure setups, the beginnings of your adventure, but also do not downplay how important they are. A good beginning can often excuse a relatively mundane adventure, or an adventure that ends up being a little short. Your players will bring from that beginning a lot. And so if the adventure ends up being pretty bog standard dungeon crawl, but the setup and the hook for that adventure is really meaty and really juicy, your players will forgive, yet another dungeon crawl, another room to room slash and grab, if they know that there's payoff at the end, and that they know that there's some story element to it. But also, they will take parts from that beginning with them. When they are camping in that first short rest for an hour, or that, camping, or, sitting down for that first short rest, or camping for that long rest, after they've really had it handed to them in the first leg of the adventure, you may find them discussing things, pulling from that lore that you put out there in the setup, and some elements of the hook, and discussing, coming up with their own theories. And it's fun. It's going to be fun for them while they speculate. And as the DM, you can often take those little tidbits and pepper them back in. It's sort of a feedback loop. You've given the players information. They are now giving you information that you may not have even thought about before. And so now you can feed it back on them. So I hope this has been useful. Beginnings for adventures are something that have and will continue to perplex and annoy DMs and GMs everywhere. But one of the things that the thing that you really want to do is you want to make sure that you're not overthinking it. You want to put thought into it, but you don't want to get bogged down. There isn't a right or a wrong way, other than the only wrong way is the way that doesn't get your players adventuring. So make sure that your hook is solid, make sure that your setup is evocative, and if you need a transition, make it dramatic. Anyways, how do you like to begin your adventures? Any clues, tips, or hints that you have, certainly go ahead and put them down below in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe. You can email me over at baittheelf@gmail.com. There is the Elfbait Facebook group, and I am Elfbait on Twitter, so you can find me there and ask me questions if you want as well. Always happy to answer them, and sometimes they become videos. This video is here because I have had people talk to me about difficulty when creating adventures, on how to set up a beginning for their adventure. Alrighty, thanks for coming back. Get out and game, and I'll see you soon.